We want to share with you the draft plan, want to describe our approach and get your feedback to finalize the plan and inform the future of coastal management in the district. Some of the overarching goals of the Coastal Marine Management Plan are to preserve ecosystems, protect district infrastructure, and provide council and staff with guidance on how to manage the district coastline in the future. So a little bit about the district coastline. West Vancouver has roughly 30 kilometers of coastline. It's an extremely valuable natural asset that's managed by the district. And as many of us are already aware, West Vancouver's coastal areas are key focal areas for our community. Coastline also provides a multitude of community benefits. So from storm protection during our winter storm events, to providing habitat for marine organisms, and also places for recreating and spending time with friends and family. But as we all know, our coastal areas are changing. They do face a wide range of challenges. We are seeing significant beach erosion, and we do have aging infrastructure along the shoreline. We have a diverse array of beach users and points of view, and we have waterfront property expectations as well. And all of these challenges are compounded by the future of climate-induced sea level rise. So the Coastal Marine Management Plan builds on 2 decades of coastal planning and management action that were previously led either by the district or local stewardship groups, or in some cases residents. And those include a couple of things. Let me just make sure this is working. Yep. The Ambleside-Dunderave long-term planning framework. It was completed in 2005. We're also building on the Shoreline Protection Plan. It was implemented between 2012 and 2015. There's also some recent work, for example, the Shoreline Protection Habitat Monitoring Report completed in 2019, and the North Shore Sea Level Rise project, which was completed in 2021. So this body of work builds on all of these pieces of previous work. A little bit about the Coastal Marine Management Plan Working Group. Lori gave a great introduction. The mandate of the Coastal Marine Management Plan Working Group is to provide policy statements. And these policy statements are going to help guide staff and council on how the waterfront is managed. Today, we're seeking input from all residents and stakeholders and yourselves on this call on the plan. The final plan will really be a criteria for making decisions on coastal issues. And as I mentioned earlier, it's going to help guide staff and council on future coastal infrastructure projects or shoreline protection projects.
And Matt, if I can just jump in for a moment, I think what we found as a working group, we were always tempted to jump into more specific recommendations and actions. But we were constantly reminded, and it makes the most sense, that this group, not being specific experts, is best able to provide what we call 10,000 feet, or really clear policy guidelines, approaches, and recommendations. And as much as, most of us want to get our fingers in and start to tinker, we really are trying to provide the district with a roadmap, and it's their job to decide down that road which turns to take, which repairs to make, etc., just to stick with my metaphor. But it was a struggle for us, but I think in the end we recognized that it's the district's job to figure out how to address the issues that we've raised and put the spotlight on.
Thanks for that. So a little bit about the timeline for developing the plan. The working group was initiated back in 2019, and they invested a significant amount of time and effort on reviewing the background information on coastal projects in West Vancouver. They met with local and regional experts, and they spent a full year really gaining a fulsome understanding of some of the coastal challenges facing the district. They then began drafting their recommendations back in February 2020, and they finished that major milestone roughly in the summer of 2020. It wasn't really until late September that drafting of the Coastal Marine Management Plan, what you have seen today, started back in late September. And several drafts and iterations later, along with internal staff review, a final draft. And I just wanted to note, well, the final draft was completed roughly in February of this year. Just wanted to note that the working group members attended meetings throughout this process and provided direction throughout as well. The process was led by district staff liaisons, myself and Corinne Amber, and we had guidance, of course, from the working group and technical support from Kerwood Lydell Associates, who are consulting coastal engineers in the Lower Mainland. So let's look at the Coastal Management Plan framework and focus areas. The plan is organized into three main policy areas or focus areas, and I'll go through them now. They are coastal dynamics and ecosystems, built infrastructure and parks, and the public-private interface. And so the plan is organized into these three policy areas, and each policy area includes information on the context and the key issues, what the supporting objectives are for each of those policy areas, and then it provides a list of recommended actions for the district to draw on to guide coastal management for the next possibly 10 to 20 years. So I'll drill down a little bit into each of those three policy areas. And let's start with the coastal dynamics and ecosystems policy direction. This policy area focuses on managing erosion and sediment transport and preserving and restoring natural habitats if and where possible. So for example, some of the key issues for this policy area included what you see here on the screen. It was identified that some information gaps on the status of the foreshore remain. So for example, where are all the important eelgrass areas in the district? Are there any? There's also development pressure along our shoreline. We see significant shoreline hardening and modification, both on public and private land. There's infrastructure development, and there's cursory impacts as well. So for example, pollution from urban runoff can affect our coastal areas as well. We're also seeing changing environmental conditions, and I'll go through that in a little more detail in upcoming slides. So including climate change and sea level rise. And these impacts have on our coastline can increase coastal flooding and foreshore erosion as well. We also see a general decline in marine habitat and the quality of marine habitat and the quantity of marine habitat. It's recognized by district residents that it's important to support natural ecosystems and biodiversity. And there is an observed reduction in biodiversity along our coastline. So a little bit about sea level rise planning in British Columbia. The province of British Columbia recommends that coastal communities, including the District of West Vancouver, prepare for sea level rise. And they recommend to prepare for 1 meter level of sea level rise by 2100 and 2 meters of sea level rise by 2200. And those are represented by the two red dots in the graph in front of you. And this slide also shows that sea level rise is anticipated to accelerate in the future. So the past predictions and past rates of sea level rise really can't be used as a predictor of future sea level rise. And so this is a graph and recommendation from the province of British Columbia. A little bit more about the causes and drivers of sea level rise. Sea level rise, as you may know, is caused primarily by two factors related to global warming. The first is the added water from melting ice sheets and glaciers. And secondly, and probably more importantly, is the expansion of seawater as it warms. And this is known as, this phenomenon is called thermal expansion. One thing to note is that local sea level rise in any one area and in the district may be more or less than the global average. And this is due to a multitude of factors. For example, the settling or sinking of land, known as subsidence. There's erosion, upstream flood control, weather, regional ocean currents, for example, and then variations in land height can all affect how much sea level rise we might see locally. So just a little bit about the potential effects of sea level rise on intertidal areas. As the sea level rises, the low and high tide lines will move further inland, and that causes these intertidal areas between the low and the high tide to also move further inland. We call this intertidal area shift. And this is effectively squeezes that intertidal area up against the upland in a phenomenon known as coastal squeeze. So we're still in the policy area of coastal dynamics and ecosystems. And this slide shows you an example of some of the policy objectives set in the plan. So for example, under coastal dynamics and ecosystems, one of the key issues is to increase the district's understanding of coastal dynamics and support natural ecosystems and biodiversity on the foreshore. Some of the supporting objectives for that key issue include offsetting intertidal habitat loss through habitat creation and enhancement. Others include prioritizing green shores or soft nature-based approaches where it's appropriate, and the use of climate resilient plant species along our coastal areas. In addition, one of the recommendations and supporting objectives was to restore sediment transport pathways to enhance beaches. So utilizing sediment transport to enhance district beaches. So moving on to the second policy area, which is built infrastructure and parks. Again, these are just examples of some of the key issues and objectives for these three policy areas. So for built infrastructure and parks, one of the key issues is to focus on protecting existing built infrastructure, including parks and natural assets from coastal hazards. And some of the key issues associated with that include the fact that there is limited, some information about waterfront infrastructure, but there are gaps in our information about infrastructure along coastal areas. We do see a deterioration of some drainage infrastructure in coastal areas. There's also the potential for future damage to infrastructures from either creek flooding or storm events, which could disrupt the delivery of community services. And we are seeing, as I mentioned earlier, coastal erosion, which is causing some of our buried infrastructure to be exposed and more vulnerable to damage or deterioration. One of the last points here under key issues is that some of West Vancouver's lands and infrastructure are owned or controlled by other jurisdictions. For example, we have the CN Railway. We're adjacent to Squamish First Nations land, and Metro Vancouver has several right-of-ways within our coastal floodplain areas. So again, just a subset of some of the policy objectives set in this plan under built infrastructure and parks. One of the key objectives is to manage built infrastructure to be more resilient to coastal hazards with limited impacts to natural ecosystems and coastal processes. The supporting objectives are to consider, for example, multiple climate scenarios and using a risk-based approach to future infrastructure planning, looking to possibly relocate or raise critical infrastructure as part of a renewal process when redeveloping coastal areas, and to preserve public beach access and promote flood resilient uses in what are considered high risk or coastal floodplain areas. So the plan specifies possible actions the district could take to support implementation of these actions. So moving over to the third policy area, the public-private interface, again, provides some of the key issues, objectives, and recommendations for managing waterfront property and the interface area between public land and waterfront properties. Some of the key issues that were identified by the working group include the fact that a large portion of the district waterfront is privately owned, and there may be diverse and potentially competing values between public and private interests. The responsibilities and rights, liabilities, and risks associated with properties in waterfront areas are still being developed. Sea level rise is affecting the world globally, and so whether costs are associated, costs associated with this changing environment that is anticipated should be borne either by a private homeowner or the tax base. It has not been wholly determined. Some private property owners have undertaken a variety of measures to protect their waterfront areas from coastal hazards. And while this is considered a good thing, in some cases, it has resulted in negative impacts on neighboring properties, as well as impacts to habitats and disruption of natural sediment transport processes. So there is a recognized need for clearer communication from the district to both private waterfront property owners and the public in general on the roles, responsibilities, the standards, and the best practices for coastal management. So just a slide here to show how different types of management strategies to manage flood and erosion hazard risks can affect the shoreline differently. So you see here, this slide shows how gradual sloping beaches can be more effective at managing waves and shoreline spray. And they can also help minimize erosion and sediment transport processes. And really the ultimate message here is that in some cases, more natural approaches can be more effective for managing certain hazards. And something to note, it does need to be applied on a case-by-case basis. This may not apply to all areas. So looking at some additional objectives and supporting objectives for the public-private interface. One of the key objectives identified was to, as I mentioned, clearly establish and communicate to property owners what coastal management on private property should look like, and also to enable owner-led initiatives with a mind to reducing impacts to intertidal habitats. So the plan also specifies possible actions the district could take to support the implementation of these actions. A little bit about adaptation approaches. The district has a number of policies and plans, initiatives underway to manage flooding and erosion along our coastline. And as the sea levels rise, there will be additional approaches that are needed. These 4 adaptation approaches were identified by the British Columbia government in their sea level rise adaptation primer. And they are resist, or also known as in some cases as protect. And really the aim in the resist approach is to prevent flooding from occurring. So typical structural measures such as building dikes or installing a seawall or riprap, a riprap line slope on private properties. That's a typical resist adaptation approach. There's other approaches. Secondly, accommodate includes things like allowing flooding to happen while reducing its impact to infrastructure and property. So this could be a combination of structural measures such as raising buildings or flood-proofing buildings, but it could also be non-structural measures such as requiring flood-proofing in future development areas that are in the coastal floodplain. There's also avoid approaches, which aim to reduce the amount of new development in high-risk areas. And they typically involve land use planning and policies to avoid building structures in coastal floodplain areas. And then finally, we have an advance approach, which aims to reclaim land and make space for structures such as dikes or other infrastructures to manage flooding. One of the most recent examples of the advance approach is the project in Toronto, where they added material to the lake to provide for increased housing. And with that, we'd like to hear what you have to say. So we encourage you to visit our project website, review all of our recommendations. We have a number of videos for you to watch that discuss the different policy areas. And of course, you're here at the virtual meeting, so you're getting that information. And if there's, we'll welcome your input. And I believe the comment form is open for input until March 31st. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Lori for final comments.
I just wanted to say thank you, Matt, for putting that together. As you can imagine, for some of us, me in particular, this was a pretty steep learning curve, and we have been very, very fortunate to learn from a number of groups in our community, such as stream keepers and Shoreline Preservation Society members and the Vancouver Aquarium, Howe Sound Biosphere Project. There have been a number of really, really helpful participants in our learning as we've tried to get our heads wrapped around this. The other thing that I think was really helpful was the slide that Matt most recently went through, which was the different approaches, and that you don't have to adopt any one of those approaches, but they are really good lenses through which you can look at a problem and decide what the best approach to take is. And that was helpful because sometimes this can seem quite overwhelming and you sort of want to throw your hands up and run to high ground, but there's a lot of very interesting stuff happening around the world, happening up and down the BC coast, happening all over Nova Scotia, California, Washington, Oregon, and there's a lot to learn, a lot being developed. And so it's kind of an interesting, I'm going to call it serendipity, that the district decided to bring this matter to the fore at this time, because I think it was very good timing.